Hey Bio20s, I'm back for another video. So we're going to get into the parts of the respiratory system today. Oh, before I forget, I left my pen downstairs, so I'll be right back. Okay, got it? So we can get going now. So, as we get into the parts of the respiratory system, before we kind of talk about the structures and what they do, I just want to discuss, well, what is the job of the respiratory system? Simply put, its job is to take oxygen from the atmosphere and deliver it to your cells. And also to take carbon dioxide from your cells, which as we know is a byproduct of cellular respiration, and deliver it to the atmosphere. So if you look at the components of the atmosphere, about 78% of our atmosphere is pretty much unusable to us. It's nitrogen. We can't use N2, we cannot use nitrogen gas. What we need to focus on is this 21%, which is oxygen. We then have some other gases that make up the remaining percentages, argon, carbon dioxide, of course, water vapor, things like that. But for the most part, when we talk about the respiratory system, our main goal is to figure out how do we get oxygen into our cells and how do we get CO2 out of our cells. So, when we talk about external respiration, this occurs in the lungs and will involve an exchange of O2 and CO2 between the air and the blood. So here's a blood vessel right here, and here's a piece inside of your lungs. And what happens is there's an exchange of gases. So oxygen is going to move from your lungs into your blood, where CO2 is going to move from your blood into your lungs. Then if you look over here, we have internal respiration, where we have an exchange between our blood and our cells. So now oxygen is going to move into our cells and CO2 is going to move out of our cells. And these two exchanges, as you can see, both involve an exchange of gases, and they both involve an exchange of gases with the blood. So, for today, main goal for today is to go through these structures, discuss what they do, and their role in the respiratory system. So starting off at the top here, we have the nasal cavity. So we have the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity, you can think of as it's your nose, right? You can breathe in through your nose. It's lined with mucus and hairs, and we can breathe oxygen and air through our nose. We then, of course, have the oral cavity. So you can breathe through your nose as well as your mouth. And I'll just trace a quick path here for you. There we go. As we breathe air in through our nose as well as through our mouth, we reach the back of our throat here, which is the pharynx. Now you'll notice that the oral cavity, as well as the pharynx, is part of what other system? If you guessed the digestive system, you would be correct. So you'll notice that as we go through these systems, that things will be shared between systems, right? Now, here's where things differ. When air goes down, we will pass this structure here, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's called the epiglottis. And what the epiglottis does is it prevents basically food from getting into our trachea, which is our windpipe. So when you're eating, the epiglottis will cover your trachea to make sure the food doesn't get down into your lungs. Now, you've probably had this before when you've had a drink of something or you've eaten something, you start coughing afterwards. Sometimes food can get in your trachea and you cough it up to get it out. As we move into the trachea itself, we'll pass by the larynx right here. So the larynx right here, that is your voice box, so it contains your vocal cords. Then we'll continue down the trachea and we'll branch off almost like a tree into two separate branches, the bronchi. And the bronchi will then branch off into smaller branches known as the bronchioles. And at the end of each bronchiole, we have these little tiny air sacs known as alveoli. which are covered in capillaries, which, if you remember from the digestive system, are the site of exchange, whether that's nutrients, waste, or gases. Other components of the respiratory system that we need to discuss, we of course have our rib cage, and in between our ribs we actually have muscles in between there we're going to talk about. And then we also have this flat sheet of muscle down here, which is known as our diaphragm. And our diaphragm will flatten or contract depending on if we're breathing in or out. So those are the structures. I'm going to go a little more in depth into each structure here, so we'll look at it one by one. So the nasal cavities, they are going to take in air. If you've ever been outside when it's really, really cold out, it kind of hurts to breathe because the air is cold and dry and it doesn't feel very good. What your nasal cavities are trying to do is warm and moisten the incoming air, right? So you're trying to warm it up and provide some moisture. If it's cold and dry, it's really tough to do that. So it kind of hurts, right? It kind of hurts to breathe when it's really cold outside. As the air goes into the back of our mouth, we then reach the pharynx, which would then branch into two openings. The esophagus, which is meant for food, and the trachea, which is meant for gas exchange. So, as we look inside our respiratory system, we'll notice that here's the trachea, here are our vocal cords, and then here's the epiglottis. And once again, the epiglottis is a flap-like covering that will prevent food from entering into the trachea. So really, really important. It prevents food from going into the trachea and getting into our lungs, which is not very good. All right, next we have the branches. So we're going down the trachea, and the trachea will branch into two smaller branches, the bronchi, which will then move air and obviously oxygen into each of our lungs. So we'll go into the right lung and into the left lung. They'll branch into even smaller branches known as the bronchioles, and then at the end of each bronchiole we have the alveoli. And the alveoli, once again, are just tiny air sacs where the air will accumulate and fill up, and then we have them covered in capillaries so the oxygen can diffuse into the blood and the CO2 can diffuse into the lungs, just like we talked about at the start of this video. Some final structures to go through here. We have our pleural membrane. This is a thin membrane that surrounds the outer surface of the lungs and lines the inner walls of our chest cavity. We then have the diaphragm, which is a dome-shaped sheet of muscle. Say that 10 times fast. That will regulate our pressure and allow us to expand or contract our chest. So we can fill up with air or push out air. And finally, if you feel in between your ribs, you'll notice there's muscle there. That's called intercostal muscles, which will actually pull your rib cage out or pull it back in depending on what you're doing. So two kind of ways we breathe. We have inhalation versus exhalation. So you can all try this at home. If you take in a deep breath and then exhale, notice what happens to your rib cage. When you move air in, your intercostal muscles will contract and pull your rib cage outward or upward. It will pull your rib cage, expanding your chest cavity, allowing you to hold more oxygen. You'll also notice that the diaphragm will contract and push down. This will also increase your overall chest cavity. Then when it's time to move air out of the lungs, the intercostal muscles relax, the rib cage will fall back into place, and the diaphragm will relax and move back up into its normal resting position. This will push the air out of your lungs. So one more time, breath in, chest moving up, and then breath out, going back to normal. So that's just a brief video on the parts of the respiratory system. Once again, your goal would be to be able to identify these parts, stay on a diagram, and be able to identify what each part does. So in the next video, we're going to discuss how does gas actually move from the atmosphere to the tissue, so oxygen, and then how does CO2 move from the tissue all the way to the atmosphere. So you can look forward to that, and I'll chat with you guys soon.